As the West became increasingly populated, the economy and landscape of the Western economy began to change, largely because as commercial activity increased, you had more agriculture, you had ranching, mining. We're going to talk about things here in a little bit. You had a need for labor. There's a problem, though. There's not a whole lot of people available for labor. Okay? So, you don't have a whole lot of people to work on. There may be jobs available in various different opportunities, but it's very unstable. Okay, so you may need to send your cattle to market. You may need to harvest crops, things along those lines. You need a labor force for that. And because the West was populated by so many different people, you have multiracial and multi-ethnic labor communities and facets. You have an angle of whites. You have an African American population that's also involved in that. You have a lot of Mexican Americans. You have Filipinos, Chinese immigrants, immigrants from Eastern Europe. Okay, you have populations of people coming from all over. So oftentimes, these folks would have to work side by side in order to get by. Okay, sometimes there would be a stratification along racial lines. So even white Europeans, Eastern Europeans, who scare me the most out of all white people, by the way, but that's a whole different story. They may have preference for the better jobs. Okay, so the idea that, okay, these folks, if you're whiter, then you're probably going to have better opportunities, that was pretty real back then. Okay, but nonetheless, the economy that emerged had to be reliant upon everyone. You had to learn to get along. Whether you worked a better job or whatnot, there was a need, and there were a lot of people from different backgrounds available to fill it as things became available, as opposed to one type of industry that may have only occurred in various different eastern seaports or whatnot. One of the economies that emerged during this time, the 1870s and 1880s, was the mining industry. So in the late 1840s, there was the California Gold Rush that drew interest for people in search of gold or silver. Well, in the late 1850s, right on the onset of the Civil War, you had a mining rush just outside of present-day Denver, Colorado, where there were various mines set up in the Washoe District to search and mine gold. So if you're a fan of the NBA and you are familiar with the team, the Denver Nuggets, okay, they're referring to Denver as having been developed and established as a mining community, those in the Washoe District looking for gold in modern day, present day rather, Colorado. Gold nugget piece. Okay, the Denver Nuggets. It's an ode to Denver's origin. Just like in San Francisco, the San Francisco 49ers are named after the gold rush of 1849. San Francisco, in a matter of months, went from a small little community to about 50,000 in a matter seemingly overnight. People in search of gold in Northern California. Same thing. San Francisco 49ers, it's paying homage to their origins as a mining town. So you have various different mining booms, not just in Colorado, but you also have some in Nevada, okay? Like the Comstock lode, for example. The Comstock lode is a silver ore. Mining for silver, it's a region in the base of a mountain in Nevada where you have a vast amount of silver ore. And it was named after a gentleman named Henry Comstock who first discovered the silver ore in Nevada. Now, Nevada, if you've ever been there, there's nothing there. It's no natural resources, really. Okay, so you may have like gold or silver ore, okay, but you don't really have navigable rivers. It's largely a desert, okay? And if you've ever been to Vegas, well, okay, Vegas gets its water and power from the Colorado River and the various different hydroelectric plants that exist a number of miles outside of town. It is literally an oasis in the middle of a desert, okay? Otherwise, though, folks coming to the Nevada lodes would have to come from places like neighboring California or bring resources from elsewhere. Okay, so these gold and silver discoveries created all kinds of excitement. So, all right, again, if you're looking for an opportunity to improve your lot, or maybe at least find seasonal work, or maybe you're an immigrant, you're trying to establish yourself in a new country, okay, you're going to work the mines. It's a dangerous job. You might make yourself reasonably wealthy by a decent standard, but the likelihood that you are going to die or have some sort of disabling accident was also pretty high. Okay? Another thing that was also a consequence of the mining industry was there weren't a whole lot of females. Obviously, it's a very heavy labor intensive job and it attracted mostly younger men. And when you have small little communities that would pop up, young men would have difficulty finding female companionship. Okay? Most of the women that did come into these mining towns would be the wives of a worker's husband. Or if there were single women, maybe maybe they're trying to earn money, I guess, as a cook, various different clean labor type jobs, but you also had a significant number of prostitution and prostitutes for that industry as well. Okay, so you would oftentimes have men who would kind of strike it rich in the mines, and if the mines eventually dried up, you might have people lose everything in a matter of minutes. Okay, but otherwise, though, the conditions in the mines themselves are very terrible, very dangerous. It wasn't until the 20th century that mines were regulated better that made them safer. But it's one way to have an opportunity and kind of a new start. So, other things that are really popular around this time that gain roots, the cattle industry really takes off. You develop a cattle kingdom. Now, we're in Texas. Texas has a very long history with the cattle industry. Ranching, as we know it, was not developed in Texas. Okay? Modern ranching actually was developed on the plains of central Spain, where you have a cattle industry and a bull and ranching type industry as well. Okay, so aside from bullfighting, Spain is known for its livestock and ranching. When Spanish settlers came to North America, they brought their ranching techniques as well as livestock with them. And they identified what is present day Texas as being ideal for ranching. It is reasonably similar to what you'd see in La Mancha or any of the central Spanish provinces that exist in and around Madrid. So, yeah, Texas would be a good place to raise cattle. So would northern Mexico, as we know it. Modern day cattle ranching comes from the Spaniards. The term vaquero, it means cowboy. Okay. In South America, vaqueros are known as gauchos. So if you go to Argentina, gauchos, they're cowboys. Okay, vaqueros. But otherwise, it's interesting how that comes about, and it was also further ingrained when Mexico declared independence from Spain, and then Texas continued that tradition of cattle ranching and having the open range. Now, you may wonder where Fort Worth gets its nickname, Cowtown. There's a reason for that. By the way, Fort Worth is not the only city in America whose nickname is Cowtown. Chicago is a cowtown. Okay? Kansas City is a cowtown. And the reason why they are all cowtowns is because in this era of American history, that is where large numbers of cattle were driven from places like Texas by land, on foot, up throughout the central plains of our country along various different trails and trade routes. So, one of the more popular and famous trails in ranching history is the Chisholm Trail. That is an actual trail where ranchers, cowboys, could take their heads of cattle and maybe merge with maybe another rancher's heads of cattle and drive all hundreds and hundreds of them along this trail to various different trading posts where they could then be sold and processed. Fort Worth is one of those trails. So if you've ever been to the stockyards in Fort Worth, you might see the mythical cowboys and they're rustling the cows. Okay, well, cool. Fort Worth was where cattle would be brought to be processed. So hope you enjoy your ribeyes and your sirloins. I do. I love ribeye. Medium rare, by the way. Okay, so you have various different cattle drives before railroads really took over that would start in places like central Texas, perhaps maybe around the San Antonio area. And along the Chisholm Trail, they would make their way to modern day Fort Worth and up into Oklahoma, maybe into Abilene, Kansas, over to Kansas City, maybe along the lines over to Chicago or St. Louis, places like that. Because of these cattle drives, you are now able to distribute cattle for sale. You can preserve your ranch in Texas and then drive them up north. Okay? The problem with cattle drives is that, boy, they're tedious. Okay? And they're slow. And the animals need plenty of grassland to graze. And if you have a harsh drought or maybe harsh winter conditions, it's going to be hard for those cattle to really have enough grass to be able to sustain their eating habits. So it begins to take its toll. Really, the 1870s and 1880s was a time frame for cattle drives, for ranchers to take their heads of cattle and head on up to Kansas. Okay, well, that becomes difficult. Another thing that also somewhat ended all these cattle drives and these long hundreds of mile drives were railroads. So in boxcars, now you can take these heads of cattle, you can move faster with fewer impediments, and you can actually process them at various different rail stations on a faster clip. So you don't need to provide as much food for them, and you can get there a lot faster than by horseback as cattle are on foot along a cattle drive. So what happens now is you begin to see a decline in the open range industry of open range cattle drives. Okay? It was somewhat short-lived, but it's iconic in American history, especially in Texas, as we have a legacy for cattle drives that run right through the Metroplex. Okay? So it wasn't just in Texas where this occurred. You would have various different places in New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, even parts of Nebraska, Missouri, and over to Illinois where Chicago is. Okay? So there in Chicago, they could then be sent across railways over to New York or Philadelphia, Boston, wherever it were. But it was those cattle drives, those iconic cattle drives that really make a difference. If you go to Fort Worth today, you can see one of the highways in South Fort Worth, Chisholm Trail Expressway. Okay? That's a paid homage to the actual physical Chisholm Trail where ranchers would take their heads of cattle for sale to be processed in Fort Worth and other different places around the southern Midwest. So you have an emerging Western economy, a cattle industry. Now you know where ranching and cattle development comes from Spaniards, adopted obviously in the New World. Um, yeah, the original cowboys were Spaniards and Mexicans, and now you also have a number of black cowboys that were involved in the industry as well. But I hope you enjoy your steak. That's where it comes from.